The village of Ardenmoor had a particular smell on mornings when smoke came down from the mountains. It was not the clean pine-edge smoke of hearth fires or the sweet char of a baker's oven catching at the edges. It was a deeper smell, older and more final, the smell of something large having burned through the night with no one to mourn it and no one to put it out. It was the smell of a world that had continued without asking permission. On the morning that everything changed, though no one in Ardenmoor knew it was that kind of morning yet, that smell arrived before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge of the Ashbeak Mountains. It came on a low wind that moved through the market lane like a quiet announcement, ruffling the canvas awnings of the spice merchants and unsettling the pigeons that roosted in the eaves of the old guild hall. It curled under doors and pressed against window glass. It made dogs lift their heads from their sleeping spots and stare toward the mountain with the alert, troubled attention of animals, who understand danger in a more immediate and uncomplicated way than people do. Ardenmoor had stood for 230 years in the shadow of the Ashbeaks, and it had learned across those years to respect what came down from them. The mountains were not simply stone and altitude, they were inhabited. They had always been inhabited in the way that very old and very large places accumulate inhabitants, not all of them visible, not all of them understandable, but all of them real. The villagers had developed a working arrangement with the reality of this, the way communities develop working arrangements with all uncomfortable truths. They did not go up past the third trail marker after dark. They did not burn signal fires on the western face during nesting season. They did not, as a general civic principle, do anything that might be reasonably interpreted as a provocation by something large enough to level the mill in a single pass. In return, the mountains were mostly quiet. The dragons, for it was dragons specifically that the arrangement concerned, though the word was rarely used directly. The villagers had a dozen circumlocutions they preferred, from the heights to the old ones to simply them up there. The dragons maintained their distance. They were seen occasionally, as dark shapes riding thermals high above the treeline, or as brief improbable shadows that crossed the sun and were gone before the eye could properly confirm what it had seen. They were a fact of the landscape, like the cold springs that came down off the glaciers in late autumn or the particular quality of the light at midsummer, and Ardenmoor had long since made its peace with facts it could not change. What Ardenmoor had not made its peace with, what no arrangement, however long-standing, could entirely prepare a community for, was the morning those facts descended into the market square and died there. Edric Voss left his house at the same time he always did, which was when the light was just beginning to find its color and the stones of the lane were still dark with night damp. He was 26 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of men who have spent years swinging heavy things, and possessed of the kind of face that people consistently underestimated, not ugly, not particularly striking, simply the face of a man who appeared to be thinking about something practical, which was usually accurate. He was thinking about a hinge. Specifically, he was thinking about a gate hinge for the miller's widow, Asta Farron, who had been waiting 3 weeks for it because the alloy she had specified was proving difficult, the proportions not sitting right no matter how he adjusted them. He had lain awake the night before turning the problem over in his mind the way he turned metal in his hands, feeling for the catch, the resistance, the place where the material wanted to go and the place where it was being forced, and he thought he might have found it. He wanted to get to the forge early, before the coals had a chance to cool from yesterday's banked heat, and test the adjustment while the solution was still clear in his mind. He had his hammer slung over one shoulder and a half-loaf of bread under his arm, and he was walking quickly and thinking about iron ratios, and he was not paying particular attention to the smell on the wind, because he had grown up with the smell of the Ashbeaks and it did not strike him as remarkable until he was already halfway down the market lane and found his path obstructed by a gathering of people who were not, for once, gathering around anything he could immediately identify. He slowed, he looked. The crowd was loose and uneven, the kind of crowd that forms not by intention but by the gradual accumulation of people who have each paused for what they tell themselves will be just a moment. Market morning crowds in Ardenmoor tended toward the purposeful people on their way to stalls, to the well to the baker, to brief and efficient transactions. And this crowd had the slightly guilty, slightly fascinated quality of people who have abandoned purpose in favor of something they cannot quite explain. They were standing in a rough semicircle that took up most of the lane, and they were very quiet for so many people gathered in one place, and they were all looking at something on the ground. Edric was taller than most of the people in front of him, and he could see over their shoulders without difficulty. What he saw made him stop walking. The hatchling was smaller than he had expected. That was his first thought, not rational, not a considered response to the situation, simply the automatic comparison his mind made between the idea of a dragon and the reality of the creature lying on the cobblestones of Ardenmoor's market square. He had a mental image of dragons constructed from 30 years of rumor and glimpse and the old stories the mountain shepherds told, and those dragons were vast and impossible and filled the sky. This creature would not have filled a garden cart. It was no larger than a medium-sized hound, and considerably more fragile-looking than any hound Edric had ever seen. Its body had the slightly translucent quality of something very new, the scales not yet fully hardened, their color a pale ashen gray that might have been almost beautiful under different circumstances, but in the flat morning light looked like the color of exhaustion. Its wings were folded tight against its sides, pressed close in the involuntary way of creatures whose bodies have made decisions their minds have not quite caught up to, and they were crumpled at the edges in a way that suggested damage, not violent damage, not the clean damage of a wound, but the soft, internal damage of something that has been under too much heat for too long. Its chest moved. That was the remarkable thing, the thing that held everyone's attention in the particular quiet way it was holding theirs. Its chest moved with each breath, but the movement was wrong, too effortful, too conscious, the kind of breathing that healthy things never think about and damaged things can think of nothing else. Every expansion of those small ribs looked like a decision. Every exhale sounded like something being carefully and unwillingly surrendered. The sound it made when it breathed was the sound of gravel shifting in a tin cup, dry and irregular and full of small protests, each one slightly different from the last, as though the machinery of breathing was improvising rather than operating. Ardenmore's 3 resident healers were already crouched around it when Edric arrived at the back of the crowd. He recognized them without needing to see their faces. The silver and green robes of the Menders Guild were distinctive, and in any case he knew all 3 of them personally, as one knew everyone in a village of 800 souls. There was Soren Aldgate, the eldest, who had delivered most of the village's children, including Edric himself, and had spent 40 years accumulating the particular brand of authority that comes not from rank but from the weight of witnessed suffering. There was Pell, her younger colleague, who was perhaps 35 and excellent with broken bones and infections and generally less certain of himself in the face of anything unusual. And there was the newest Myra, barely 2 years in Ardenmore, who had the slightly too eager quality of someone who had studied hard for examinations that had not quite prepared her for the reality of their subject matter. All 3 were working. Soren had 2 fingers pressed to the side of the hatchling's throat, her eyes closed in the particular focused absence healers wore when they were listening to something inside a body. Pell was moving a small glass vial back and forth before the creature's nostrils, reading the response. Myra had her reference, a small, densely annotated book she carried everywhere open across one knee, and was moving her finger rapidly down a page, her lips pressed together. None of what they were doing appeared to be helping. The hatchling lay on the cobblestones and breathed its difficult, rattling breaths and did not appear to notice or care about the activity surrounding it, which was itself a kind of answer. Soren opened her eyes and withdrew her fingers. She did not stand immediately, she remained crouched, looking at the hatchling with an expression that Edric had seen on her face before, though usually in the rooms of the very old, and it was the expression she wore when she was performing the internal transition between the version of a situation in which her help was still meaningful and the version in which it was not. When she stood, she did it with the careful slowness of a woman whose knees had made a separate arrangement with time, and she brushed the ash from her robes. There was ash on the cobblestones around the hatchling, fine and pale, the remnants of whatever fire had come down the mountain on the night wind, and she said, in her carrying and entirely undramatic voice, "Smoke lung." The word moved through the crowd the way a stone moves through still water, in rings. Some people who did not know the term looked to their neighbors for explanation. Others who did know, it made very small, very controlled expressions that contained a great deal of feeling kept carefully in place. The fire that destroyed the nest, Soren continued, still in that carrying, matter-of-fact tone, burned hot and close. The smoke was dense. For a creature this young whose air sacs are still in their first weeks of function, prolonged exposure causes scarring along the internal passages. She paused, not for effect, but because she was choosing her words with the care of someone who has learned that imprecision causes a different kind of harm. The scarring is progressive. The body's own processes attempting to repair the damage create further blockage. There is nothing in our inventory that addresses damage at this level. The tissue repair required is beyond the scope of topical or systemic treatment available to us here, and likely beyond the scope of such treatment anywhere within practical reach. Another pause. "I am sorry." She said the last 2 words to the hatchling, which surprised several people in the crowd who had expected them to be directed at the crowd itself, or perhaps at no one in particular. She said them in the same tone she used for everything else, not warm, not cold, simply honest. And then she stepped back and began the process of repacking her kit, because there was nothing more she could contribute here, and she had other patients whose conditions had not yet reached the point of being beyond contribution. Pell looked relieved in the way of people who have not yet developed the specific muscle that allows one to remain in a room where one cannot help. He began packing his kit as well, with slightly more haste than Soren and slightly less ceremony. Myra closed her book and held it against her chest and continued to look at the hatchling with the expression of someone who has studied hard and is confronting, perhaps for one of the first genuine times, the gap between what can be learned from books and what the world actually requires of knowledge. The crowd murmured. It was the sound of a collective discomfort finding its voice, not grief, not exactly, because these were not people who had known the hatchling or felt its absence as a personal loss, but something adjacent to grief, the faint residue of witnessing that accumulates when one watches something end. Some people stepped back. Some people exchanged low words with their neighbors. The village elder, a heavyset man named Croft who had held the position for 12 years, and who had developed, across those 12 years, the habit of composing the official version of events while they were still happening, was already visible toward the edge of the crowd with the thoughtful, slightly distant expression of someone selecting phrasing. A woman near the front said, to no one in particular, that it was terrible but really what could one do? A man near her agreed and added that it was a mercy in a way, and someone else agreed with that too. Mercy was the word the crowd reached for, because it was the word that made the situation manageable, that transformed it from a death happening in the middle of the morning into something with a kind of narrative logic, a shape, an ending that could be accepted rather than simply endured. A dragon hatchling without a nest, without a mother, without a flight to receive it and teach it, and provide the complex social architecture that young dragons apparently required just as young humans required it. Such a creature was, as everyone knew, already as good as dead even if its lungs were whole. The mountains did not give second chances. The flights were closed systems. The social bonds forged early and maintained fiercely, and a hatchling outside that system was a hatchling outside survival. The lung damage was simply the mechanism. The outcome would have been the same regardless. This logic was sound. It was also the logic of people preparing to leave. The hatchling moved. The movement was so small and so effortful that it almost didn't register, a slight shift of the head, a fraction of a turn, the kind of motion that costs a great deal when the body has very little left to spend. But it was deliberate. That was the thing that stopped the murmuring and the low consensus building and the gentle, comfortable drift toward leaving. The movement was deliberate in a way that mere pain or reflex is not. It had the quality of intention. The hatchling's head lifted from the cobblestones. Slowly, with visible effort, the way a door opens against a stiff spring, not impossible, not easy, simply a thing that required being done and was therefore being done. Its neck was thin and the muscles along it were visibly working, the small tendons standing out in ridges beneath the pale scales as it raised its head and held it there, trembling slightly with the effort of remaining upright and turned. Its eyes, when they opened, were extraordinary. That was the only word available for them, and it did not quite do the job. They were large for its head, disproportionately large, the eyes of a creature built to see in darkness and distance and the fine gradations of heat that regular eyes could not parse, and they were pale, the color compromised by the smoke that had damaged everything else, a haze over what might have been in health a deep and clear amber. They were, in their current state, the eyes of something looking through fog toward a shore it could not quite make out. But they were looking, actively, deliberately, with the particular quality of a gaze that is searching for something specific rather than simply registering the environment. The hatchling's head turned in a slow arc, and those pale eyes moved across the gathered faces of Ardenmoor's market morning crowd, and they did not stop. They moved past Soren, who was still packing her kit and did not look up. Past Pell, who was watching with the careful non-attachment of a professional maintaining appropriate distance. Past Myra, who was watching with exactly too much attachment and holding her book so tightly her knuckles had paled. Past the woman who had said it was terrible, but what could one do? And the man who had said it was a mercy, and the village elder composing his phrasing, and the baker who had come out from his shop still holding a paddle, and the two children who had pushed to the front and were being tugged back by a parent who wasn't sure they should be seeing this, and the shepherd who had been up since before dawn and smelled of lanolin and cold air and who had, unlike most of the crowd, the specific expression of someone who had watched things die before and had not yet decided how to feel about watching it again. The hatchling's gaze moved through all of them, and none of them were what it was looking for. Edric had been standing at the back of the crowd. He had not pushed forward. It was not his way to push forward in crowds, not out of shyness but out of a certain respect for other people's space and a general sense that proximity rarely added information. And so he had been watching from a slight elevation over the heads of those in front of him, which meant he had a clearer view than most of exactly what was happening. He had watched Soren's assessment. He had watched the crowd's response to it. He had watched the social machinery of a community arriving at a shared conclusion, the murmured agreements, the small steps back, the reaching for the word mercy with the calm, observational quality that was perhaps his most fundamental characteristic, the quality that made him good at his trade and socially uncomplicated and occasionally irritating to people who wanted a stronger reaction from him than he generally provided. He was not in this moment thinking anything in particular, he was watching. And then the hatchling's eyes found him and stopped, and the quality of the situation changed in a way he could not have precisely described. It was not dramatic. There was no flash, no sound, no physical sensation he could point to. It was simply the ordinary experience of making eye contact with something, except that the something was a dying dragon hatchling who had just spent considerable effort it could not afford to spend scanning a crowd of 30 people, and had elected, for reasons entirely its own, to stop at him. The pale, smoke-hazed eyes held his gaze with a steadiness that was, given the state of everything else about the creature, startling. The rest of it was failing. The eyes were not. Several seconds passed. Edric stood at the back of the crowd with his hammer on his shoulder and his bread under his arm and looked at the hatchling looking at him, and something moved in him that he would not have known how to name, that he would not have attempted to name even if pressed, because he was not generally a man who found naming things particularly useful. It was enough that it moved. It was enough that it was real. The hatchling began to move. It did not simply turn toward him. That description, accurate as far as it went, missed everything about the quality of what happened next. The hatchling did not turn toward Edric the way a dog turns toward a sound, with quick animal reflex and easy adjustment. It turned toward him the way a person turns toward something they have decided, after consideration, to move toward deliberately, with commitment, having already performed the internal calculation and arrived at a conclusion, and set aside the questions that calculation could not answer. It moved on its belly because its legs were not up to the work of carrying it upright. The clawed feet found the cobblestones and pressed against them, providing purchase and direction if not elevation, and the body came forward in a kind of slow, terrible drag that should have looked pathetic, and did in the plain visual sense of the word, but that somehow also looked like something else entirely. Something that, for lack of a better word, looked like will. The crowd parted for it, not all at once, not with dramatic urgency, but in the way that people move aside for things they cannot categorize, not out of fear exactly, but out of the instinctive deference that bodies pay to things that seem, in ways they cannot articulate, to know what they are doing. The murmuring stopped. The casual stepping back gave way to something more attentive. People turned to watch the progress of the hatchling across the cobblestones without knowing quite why they could not look away. Each movement it made was audible. The scratch of the claws against stone, the slight, wet labor of its breathing, the occasional pause, brief and costly-looking, where it held itself still and gathered what it had and continued. It was perhaps 12 feet from Edric when it started moving toward him, and 12 feet for a creature in that condition was not a short distance. It was a distance that required choosing again and again and again to continue. Myra said in a soft and slightly stunned voice, "It's going to the man at the back." Soren, who had finished packing her kit and had turned to observe, said nothing. Her expression had changed from the careful neutrality she wore when delivering difficult information to something less legible, not quite surprise, since Soren Aldgate had been in the world long enough that surprise was a resource she deployed sparingly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, possibly. The look of a person encountering a thing they have read about but not expected to witness. Pell said, "Should we?" and then stopped, because he had not finished forming the thought before its impracticality became apparent. The small girl who had been tugged back by her parent had tugged herself back to the front. Her mother was no longer trying to move her. They both watched. When the hatchling reached Edric's boots, it stopped. Not because it had run out of intention. It stopped the way a journey stops when the destination has been reached, not exhaustion, not collapse, but arrival. It lay on the cobblestones at Edric's feet and breathed its difficult, rattling breaths and looked up at him, and there was in that upward look a quality that Edric would spend a long time afterward failing to find an adequate word for. It was not pleading. It had not come this far to plead. It was not the look of a creature waiting to see what the human would do, with the possibility held open that the human might disappoint it. It was the look of a creature that had already, through whatever process it used for such determinations, resolved the question of what the human would do. It looked at him the way one looks at a door one has already decided to walk through. Edric looked down at it for a moment. 30 people watched him look at it. He was aware of this, he was not an unobservant man, and the awareness registered and then moved to the background without particularly affecting anything. Because what the crowd thought about this was a secondary concern, and he was not a man who allowed secondary concerns to dominate. He thought briefly about the hinge, the forge, the morning he had planned. He thought about these things the way one thinks about the previous contents of a shelf when something new has been placed on it, nodding them, acknowledging their recent reality, and understanding without drama that the current situation has altered their arrangement. Then he sat down on the cobblestones. Not beside the hatchling, not at a careful, sanitary distance. He folded himself down to sit directly in front of it, cross-legged on the cold stone so that they were more or less at the same level, his eyes and its eyes, his face and its face, the enormous and the very small regarding each other from a distance of perhaps 18 inches. His hammer he set beside him on the stone. His bread he set on top of the hammer. His hands he placed on his knees, open, not reaching, not offering, simply present. "Hello," he said. His voice was the same voice he used for everything, low and unhurried and slightly rough from a morning that had not yet included much speech. He said it without irony and without the performance of someone trying to demonstrate something to a watching crowd. He said it because it was the thing one said at the beginning of an encounter, and whatever this was, it was a beginning. The hatchling made a sound. It was a sound that did not fit neatly into any category that Edric had available to him. He had heard dogs growl and dogs whimper, and he had heard the sounds wounded animals made when they were frightened and the sounds they made when they were past fear, and had arrived at something quieter on the other side of it. He had heard his nephew, at 2 years old, make the sound that meant not crying but the recognition that crying was near, the sound that existed in the space between distress and its expression. The sound the hatchling made was somewhere in all of that and not quite any of it rough with damage, carrying within it the audible evidence of the scarring Soren had described. But underneath the roughness something else, something with a different quality, something that moved along a register that Edric felt more than heard. He did not try to interpret it. He received it and held it and let it mean what it meant without imposing a translation. Then the hatchling placed its head on his knee. Slowly, with the same exhausting deliberateness it had brought to everything since it had lifted its head off the cobblestones, it lowered its chin to his knee and rested there. The weight of it was surprising, denser than it looked, the bones built for the demands of a creature meant to become large and powerful, still small but already with the structural suggestion of what they were growing toward. The scales were warm. Not uncomfortably so, not the contained fire heat of the stories, the heat that scorched and blistered, but a dry, steady warmth, like sun-warmed stone, like the side of the forge in the late afternoon when the day's work was winding down. Edric felt it settle. His hand moved before he had consciously decided to move it, not a dramatic or sudden motion, just the ordinary movement of a hand toward a thing it is near, the reflex of a person who works with his hands and understands the world primarily through the information his hands bring him. It settled on the hatchling's neck, carefully, with the kind of care one takes with things that are fragile in ways not immediately apparent. He felt the scales, each one small and slightly uneven, the texture of something still forming. He felt the pulse beneath them, fast, too fast, the rapid-fire heartbeat of a small creature under enormous stress but regular, present, not yet giving up. He felt the heat and the life and the damage all at once, and he held what he felt without judgment, without the need to arrive at a conclusion about it, and remained where he was. Soren spoke from somewhere behind him. Her voice had changed, not softened exactly, because softening was not really what Soren's voice did, but adjusted, recalibrated toward a register she used for things she had not encountered before, and was therefore approaching with the methodical care she applied to all unknown things. It is seeking warmth, she said. Dying animals often seek warmth in their final hours, the body. It walked past you, said the small girl in the crowd. Her voice was clear and factual and completely without malice. It was simply a statement about what had happened, offered in the way children offer such statements, without the social processing that adults apply to inconvenient truths, without the protective softening that makes difficult observations easier to receive and therefore easier to dismiss. It walked past you. Soren said nothing. The child's mother said her name in a hushed, cautionary tone. The child did not take it back because it was true and she knew it was true and she was 7 years old and had not yet learned that truth and social grace were sometimes competing interests requiring negotiation. Edric did not say anything either. He was looking at the top of the hatchling's head at the small nubs where horns would eventually grow, if it lived long enough for that, and at the fine, pale ridge of scales along its skull, and at the way the morning light, which had finally cleared the ridge and was now filling the market square with its thin early-hour gold, caught the edges of those scales and found in them a color that was not gray at all but something between silver and the memory of fire. He was thinking about what dying things look for. He was thinking about his father, who had died 3 winters ago from a fever that arrived quickly and left no time for preparation, and who had in his last hours not wanted the healer or the priest or the village elder with his official gravity, but had asked for Edric specifically, had held onto Edric's hand with surprising force and had not said anything in particular, had simply required the presence, the specific presence of this one person. For reasons that Edric had never quite understood and had not been able to ask about, and had long since stopped trying to resolve into something explicable. He thought he might, sitting here on these cold cobblestones with this small creature resting its impossible weight on his knee, be beginning to understand. The crowd did not leave all at once. They left in the way of crowds when the event they have gathered for resolves into something quiet, in ones and twos sheepishly with backward glances that tried to appear casual and did not quite manage it. The baker went back to his bread. The shepherd went back to wherever shepherds go at that hour. The 2 children were finally successfully steered away, the older one craning her neck until the last possible moment. Pell left, Myra lingered, watching with that expression of a student confronting the gap between knowledge and experience, and then left too, her book still pressed against her chest like a shield or an offering. The village elder Croft approached Edric before leaving. He stood at a respectful distance and looked at the situation, the forge worker sitting on the cobblestones, the dying hatchling's head on his knee, the two of them in the low morning light, and he said, "Is there anything you need, Edric?" Edric thought about this seriously the way he thought about everything. "No," he said at last, "thank you." Croft nodded. He looked once more at the hatchling with an expression that was doing a great deal of quiet work, and then he left. Soren was the last of the crowd to remain, and she did not leave, not yet. She stood slightly to one side, her kit at her feet, and she watched with the attentiveness she brought to things she was still in the process of understanding. She had delivered Edric into the world, which gave her a claim on him she rarely exercised and never articulated, and she looked at him now with an expression that was partly professional and partly something that had nothing to do with her profession at all. The hatchling breathed. In and out, slow and labored and irregular but continuous. The gravelina-tin sound of it filled the space that the crowd had vacated, and in the absence of the murmuring and the shuffling it was very present, that sound inescapable and intimate, the sound of a body working very hard to remain in the world. Edric's hand remained on the hatchling's neck. He was not thinking about the hinge anymore. He was not thinking about the forge. He was not in any active way thinking about anything at all. He had arrived at the state of presence that he sometimes reached in the best hours of his work, when the problem and the solution and the hands and the material had all aligned, and the thinking became something other than thought, became instead a kind of listening. A state of readiness for the information the world was prepared to offer if you stopped generating your own noise long enough to receive it. He was listening to the hatchling breathe. And the hatchling was breathing. And the morning was coming in over the mountains in long, level bars of pale gold, and the market square was emptying, and the smell of ash was still on the air from whatever had burned in the night above the tree line. And somewhere up there was a nest reduced to cinders, and a flight diminished by one, and a small, damaged, improbably determined creature who had looked at an entire crowd of people who might have helped it, and had crawled past all of them to find the one who would simply, without condition or expectation, remain. Edric sat on the cold cobblestones. "All right," he said quietly, meaning every syllable of it, "I'm here." The hatchling exhaled, a long, rough, uneven sound that was not quite a sigh but held within it everything a sigh was meant to express, and its body imperceptibly settled. Not dying, not yet done, simply resting for the first time since the fire in a place it had decided was safe. Soren watched this for a moment longer, then she said very quietly to no one in particular or perhaps to the morning itself, "Well," and picked up her kit and left them there. The cold of the cobblestones came up through Edric's clothing in the way that cold always found its way into still things. Not in a rush, not with any particular urgency, but steadily, with the patient persistence of temperatures seeking equilibrium. He had been sitting for perhaps 20 minutes before he noticed it properly, and by then it had moved past the backs of his thighs and settled into his lower spine. A deep, flat ache that he registered and set aside the way he set aside most discomforts, nodding them, filing them, declining to give them more authority than they had earned. The market square was quiet now. Not empty. Ardenmore was not the kind of village that ever fully emptied its central space during waking hours, and there were people moving at its edges, conducting the ordinary business of the morning. But the gathered crowd was gone, dispersed back into the routine of their day, and what remained was a loose peripheral awareness, the glances that slid past Edric and the hatchling from a distance and then moved on, the brief pauses of people nodding the situation and electing not to involve themselves in it. He did not blame them for this. He might have done the same this morning if things had been different. The hatchling had not moved since settling its head on his knee. This was both reassuring and not in the way of most things about the hatchling's current condition. It was reassuring because its stillness had the quality of rest rather than collapse. The muscles along its neck were not rigid with the tension of a body fighting itself, but slack in the particular way of things that have, for the moment, stopped fighting and are simply allowing themselves to be in the condition they are in. It was not reassuring because the stillness also had the quality of conservation, of a creature marshalling what it had left with the care of someone managing a dwindling resource. Its breathing had not improved. It had not worsened either, which Soren would later tell him was itself remarkable, but in the present moment the absence of deterioration was difficult to find comforting when the baseline was already so poor. Each breath it drew was still that labored, rattling work, still the gravelina-tin sound, still the visible effort of those small ribs expanding against what felt like considerable resistance. Still the exhale that came slightly too long after the inhale, as though the body needed a moment to negotiate before releasing what it had gathered. Edric sat with all of this and did not try to resolve it. He was not, by nature, a man who reached for resolution prematurely. He had learned this in the forge, that there was a specific failure mode that came from deciding what the material was going to do before you had listened to what it was actually doing, and that this failure mode cost more time and more metal than simple patience would have cost. And that patience was therefore not the soft virtue people who didn't work with their hands sometimes treated it as but a rigorous discipline with practical consequences. He brought this discipline now to the present situation, and sat with the hatchling's difficult breathing and the cold coming up through the stones, and did not attempt to arrive at a conclusion about what it meant or where it was going. He simply stayed. It was Nella who found him there when the sun had moved another hand's width up the sky. Nella ran the forge on the days Edric was not there. She was his journeywoman, 2 years into her training, the daughter of the previous smith, who had taken on Edric as an apprentice when he was 11 and had died when Edric was 22, and had left him the forge and the tools and the quiet, immense responsibility of continuing a trade that a community depended on. Nella was 17, capable in the focused and slightly reckless way of people who are still learning where the limits of their capability actually lie. And she had come looking for Edric because there was a delivery of iron waiting at the gate, and she needed the key to the supply lock. She stopped at the entrance to the market square when she saw him, took in the situation with the quick comprehensive look of someone whose trade required accurate assessment of conditions, and then crossed the square to him without apparent hesitation. "That's a dragon," she said, when she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. "Yes," Edric said. "A baby one's." "Oh, yes." She crouched down beside him, studying the hatchling with the focused attention she brought to new things, cataloging and assessing. She did not reach toward it. She was, among her other qualities, a person who understood the difference between curiosity and intrusion. "It's sick," she said. "Smokelung Sarin was here this morning." Nella absorbed this. She knew what smokelung meant. Everyone in a mountain village knew what smokelung meant, because it visited livestock occasionally in bad fire seasons, and the conversation it prompted was always the same conversation with the same ending. She looked at Edric's hand on the hatchling's neck, and at the hatchling's head on his knee, and at the expression on Edric's face, which was his ordinary expression and therefore difficult to read but which she had been reading, across 2 years of daily proximity with some degree of accuracy. "The key's on the hook by the door," he said. "Take the delivery in, I'll be along." She stood, she looked at the hatchling once more, then she looked at Edric. "You're going to miss the whole morning, aren't you?" "The hinge will keep," he said. There was a pause in which Nella conducted some internal calculation, the details of which she kept to herself. Then she said, "I'll start the coals," and left, which was the most useful thing she could have done and exactly what he had expected her to do, and one of the reasons he was glad every day that she was who she was. The thing that Edric was beginning to understand, sitting there in the lightning morning with the hatchling's weight on his knee and his hand on its neck, was that he had been wrong about what was happening. Not wrong in the way of having made an error, but wrong in the way of having used an inadequate frame, of having looked at the situation through a lens that could capture some of its features but missed the essential one. He had understood it initially as a dying creature seeking comfort. This was not inaccurate. The hatchling was dying and it had sought him out, and there was comfort in proximity, and all of that was true as far as it went. But it did not go far enough, and the insufficiency of it had been nagging at him in the way that wrong measurements nagged at him, not loudly, not urgently, but persistently, a small and steady friction that would not resolve until the error was corrected. The hatchling had not chosen him because he was nearby. He had been at the back of the crowd. There had been 30 people closer. It had not chosen him because he was warm. He was no warmer than any other person in the square, and considerably less warm than several, including Jem the baker, who ran hot as a matter of professional habit and had been standing 3 rows in front of Edric when the hatchling began its scan. It had not chosen him because he was a healer, or a mage, or possessed of any quality that the hatchling could have identified at a glance as particularly useful to its condition. He was a forge worker with a hammer and some bread, and the slightly distracted expression of a man thinking about iron ratios. He was, by any reasonable external assessment, unremarkable. And yet the hatchling had looked at 30 people and moved past all of them and expended what was, for a creature in its condition, an enormous amount of the very resource it could least afford to spend, in order to reach him specifically. Edric turned this over in his mind with the same methodical attention he gave to problems of material and form. He was not a man who believed in mysticism, not in the casual decorative way that some people believed in it, as a pleasant supplement to the practical world. But he was a man who believed rigorously in cause and effect, who believed that things happened for reasons, and that the reasons could be found if you looked at the evidence with sufficient honesty and without insisting in advance on which reasons you preferred to find. He looked at the evidence. The hatchling had looked at 30 people. It had moved past healers, past a woman who was clearly grieving for it, past children who would have adored it, past the village's elder and authority. And it had stopped at the man who, when the crowd began its gentle drift toward the door, had not moved a single step. That was the thing, that was the variable the others did not share. Edric had not stepped back. Not from courage, he had not felt the pull to step back, had not experienced the situation as one that required courage to remain in. He had simply not been drawn toward leaving, because leaving had not occurred to him as an option, because the situation in front of him was real and leaving would have made it slightly less real, and he had an instilled, fundamental resistance to making real things less real by turning away from them. He thought about what it would be like to be the hatchling. He thought about lying on the cold stones of a strange place, in a body that was failing, in a world that had just removed every familiar thing, the nest, the warmth, the flight, the enormous complex social world that a young dragon was supposed to grow up inside of, learning its shape and its rules and its particular forms of love. All of it gone. The smoke and the fire, and then this strange flat place full of strange upright creatures who smelled of livestock and bread and metal, and who gathered around you and looked at you and said words you could not understand in voices that were not unkind but were not in any way that mattered what you needed. What would you look for in that situation? What would be the thing worth spending your last resources to find? Not a cure, you would have understood by then through the particular pragmatic honesty of animals who do not construct elaborate stories about their own condition, that a cure was not coming. The healers had crouched and measured and consulted and communicated their conclusion through the quality of their attention, the way it changed from focused to careful to the specific quiet of people performing a withdrawal. You would have understood what that meant. You would have been looking for something else. You would have been looking for someone who would not leave. Not someone who would stay because they were supposed to. Not someone performing the duty of presence, ticking the moral box of not having abandoned you, all the while internally already somewhere else. Someone for whom leaving genuinely had not arrived as an option. Someone whose staying was not an act of will overcoming the desire to go, but simply the absence of that desire, the radical, uncomplicated absence of any pull toward anywhere other than here. Edric sat with this understanding for a while, turning it over, checking it against the evidence the way he checked measurements. It held. He looked down at the hatchling. The hatchling was not looking back, its eyes were closed, or nearly closed, a thin pale crescent visible beneath the lids. But its breathing was still happening, regular as the tick of a clock that is running slow but has not yet stopped. "All right," he said again, to no one in particular or perhaps to himself, confirming something. "All right." He could not carry it to his house immediately. He understood this with the practical clarity that governed most of his decisions. The hatchling had arrived at a state of provisional stability, the kind of fragile equilibrium that could be maintained under current conditions but was vulnerable to change. And moving it now, before he had any better understanding of its condition or any sense that it had the reserves to handle the disruption of transit, seemed to him precisely the kind of action that solved a visible problem by creating a less visible one. So he waited. He sat in the market square as the morning built itself around him, as the stalls opened and the ordinary commerce of the day asserted itself, as the smell of bread and fresh-cut wood and the particular cold metal smell of the coin dealer's tables accumulated in the air around the more persistent smell of ash from the mountains. People passed and slowed and looked and moved on. A few stopped long enough to exchange a word with him, not about the hatchling mostly or not directly, but the brief, oblique checking-in conversations of neighbors who had noticed an unusual situation and wanted to register their awareness of it without committing to any particular response. He answered them in his usual way, which was briefly and without encouraging further elaboration, and they went on their way, and the square continued to do what squares do. Around the mid-morning mark, Asta Farron appeared. She was a small woman, the miller's widow, who had been waiting 3 weeks for the gate hinge and who had the kind of patience with Edric that people developed when they had known someone long enough to understand that their slowness was not indolence but a different and generally more reliable relationship with time. She stopped at a comfortable distance from the hatchling, looked at it with an expression of composed assessment, and then looked at Edric. "I heard," she said. "I expect most people have," he said. "The hinge can wait," she said. "I wanted you to know that, not because of," she gestured vaguely at the hatchling, indicating that she was not making a transaction of it, not trading patience for the moral credit of having been patient at a difficult time. "Just because it can wait." "I know," he said, "thank you." She nodded. She looked at the hatchling once more with the expression of someone doing rapid and private arithmetic. Then she reached into the basket she was carrying, which contained the purchases she had made this morning at the market, and took out a cloth-wrapped parcel that turned out to be a round of soft cheese and half a small loaf. and she said it beside Edric on the cobblestones without a word of explanation and without waiting for thanks and left. Edric looked at the food. He discovered, hungry. It had been several hours since breakfast, and he had put down his original bread at some point without eating it, and it had been acquired by a bold pigeon who was now regarding him from a short distance with the affronted expression of a pigeon that considers all available bread to be in principle its bread. He ate some of the cheese and the bread in small, unhurried bites, and the day continued around him. The first time the hatchling made a sound that was not breathing, it was so quiet that Edric nearly missed it. It was late morning. The sun had climbed to the point where it sat above the market's tallest awning and the square was no longer in shadow, and the warmth of it was reaching the cobblestones and Edric's shoulders and the pale scales of the hatchling's back. The hatchling had shifted slightly in the warmth, the way sleeping things shift, a small, unconscious adjustment toward the source of better conditions. Not waking, not deciding, simply the body conducting its own quiet negotiations with the environment. And then it made a sound. It was low, lower than Edric would have expected from something so small, a sound with resonance to it, with the early suggestion of the deep registers that very large creatures owned, but that this creature was only just beginning to explore. It was not the rough, damaged growl whimper of its earlier communication. It was smoother than that, though still imperfect, still carrying the audible evidence of the scarred passages it had to travel. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds and then stopped. Edric sat very still and said nothing and waited. After perhaps a minute, the sound came again. Slightly longer this time. Slightly more confident, as though the first attempt had been exploratory and the silence that followed it had been assessed and found acceptable, not a rejection, not a warning, simply the quiet of a person listening and therefore an invitation to continue. He did not know what the sound meant. He would have been making a considerable error, he felt, to pretend that he did, to map onto it some human emotional content, and then respond to the mapped version rather than the real one. He did not know the grammar of this communication. He did not know what the hatchling was trying to express, whether it was pain or acknowledgement or something without a human equivalent, some form of expression that existed between dragons and served a function he had no frame for. What he knew was that it was communicating, that it had gone from the stillness of a creature conserving everything it had to the effort of making a sound, that making the sound cost something, given the state of its passages, and it was making it anyway. He did the thing he would have done in the forge, when a piece of metal made a sound he didn't recognize. He stopped what he was doing and he listened to it without trying to explain it. Just received it, just let it be the thing it was, and paid attention to what information it offered of its own accord rather than the information he was trying to extract from it. "I hear you," he said, not because he understood, but because acknowledgement was possible even when comprehension was not, and the hatchling deserved at least that much. The sound came a third time, and this time there was something in it that Edric could only describe afterward as a quality of settling. The sound of something that has been held tensely for a long time and is, very cautiously, beginning to consider the possibility of release. He brought it home in the early afternoon, when the sun was at its warmest, and the hatchling had drunk a small amount of water from his cupped hand, and had shifted from lying on his knee to lying alongside him with its head pressed against his thigh. A change in position that had taken considerable internal negotiation on the hatchling's part and considerable stillness on Edric's, both of them moving through the transition with the care of people who understand that trust, once offered, can be refused by carelessness. His house was 10 minutes' walk from the market square, down a lane that ran alongside the back of the forge and opened into a quieter part of the village where the houses had small yards, and the noise of the market was reduced to a background hum. It was a modest house, 2 rooms and a loft, which was more than enough for one person, with a kitchen that doubled as a workroom and a hearth that was kept well because he understood the difference between a well-kept fire and the alternative and had no patience for the alternative. Carrying the hatchling was a negotiation. It did not want to be picked up in the way that animals who had been handled since birth submitted to being picked up, with the passive cooperation of a creature that has accepted human hands as a fact of its existence. It was not passive. It permitted itself to be lifted with the specific, deliberate permission of something that is choosing to allow an action rather than simply failing to prevent it. And there was a difference, a meaningful one that Edric felt in the quality of its body against his, not the dead weight of surrender, but the live weight of something present and watching and maintaining, even in this vulnerability, a sense of its own agency. He walked carefully, he did not rush. He spoke quietly as he walked, not to the hatchling specifically, not addressing it with the performed cheerfulness some people used with animals as though the volume and brightness of the voice could substitute for actual communication, but simply talking in his low and unhurried way about where they were going and what the house was like, and that the hearth would be warm and that he would send Nella to the apothecary for whatever she thought might help. Though he said this last part knowing that what might help was in a category that mostly contained things that wouldn't, and not pretending otherwise. The hatchling made no response to this. It lay in his arms with its head tucked slightly and its eyes moving, tracking the unfamiliar passage of the lane, the unfamiliar light between the buildings, the unfamiliar smell of a village that was not mountains and not the flight's territory but something entirely new, and those pale, smoke-hazed eyes were alert in a way that its posture was not, doing the work that the rest of its body could not currently manage. The first week was a discipline in smallness. Edric was not by nature a person who did things in small increments. He was a forge worker accustomed to the long arc of a project, the patience of building through stages toward a completed form, but the stages themselves were substantial, the material responsive to significant effort. What the hatchling required was different. It required a responsiveness to very small signals, a sensitivity to gradations of change that were so fine they could be missed entirely by someone who was not deliberately watching for them. It required the discipline of not doing, of recognizing that the most harmful thing available to him was the urge to act, to intervene, to apply effort to the problem in the hope that effort itself was a solution. He gave it water first. Not by force, not by any technique. He simply kept a shallow bowl near where it rested and put his finger in the water and let it see him do this, and he waited. And on the second day of this routine, the hatchling lowered its head to the bowl and drank 3 small cautious swallows, and then raised its head and regarded him with those pale eyes that were beginning at their edges to clear. He noted the clearing of the eyes the way he noted all changes, carefully, without celebration, treating the data as data rather than as permission for an emotion he was not yet sure the situation warranted. The eyes clearing could mean improvement or it could mean a different stage of the same decline. He did not know enough yet to distinguish between them, and so he held his assessment lightly and continued watching. Nella came by each day, sometimes twice. She brought things from the apothecary. Soren had provided a list of mild, supportive preparations, things that would not treat the smokelung directly but might ease the body's effort and provide some of what the hatchling was not eating yet. And the apothecary, a man named Draven who had the particular careful creativity of someone who dealt in things that had to work, had added several preparations of his own devising that he sent with a note explaining his reasoning. Edric read the note and was impressed by the reasoning and applied the preparations as directed. He also sent Nella to the guild library, not the small public one, but the Mender's archive that Soren had access to and had indicated, in a brief visit on the second day, that he could consult if he wanted to, in a tone that suggested she thought he might find it useful without specifying what she thought he would find. He sent Nella rather than going himself because he did not want to leave the hatchling for the hour that would have required, and because Nella was quick and observant and had his trust, and had the sense to write down what she found rather than trying to retain it in summary. She came back with 4 pages of dense notes, and an expression that contained several things at once. "There's not much," she said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table while the hatchling slept on the folded blankets near the hearth. "About smokelung specifically in dragons, it's not well documented. Most of what's there is old, pre-guild some of it." "What does it say?" "That it's usually fatal, in young ones very fast." She looked at the hatchling, "usually within the first day." They both looked at the hatchling, which was on its 4th day, and was, at this moment, making the slow, regular movements of an animal in something resembling genuine sleep, rather than the shallow, watchful rest of the first days. "There's something else," Nella said. She slid 2 of her pages across the table. He read them. They were her transcription of something she had found in a section of the archive that dealt with unusual dragon behaviors, compiled by a healer named Avarice Kale who had worked in a mountain region 200 years ago, and who had written in the dense, economical style of someone who expected her readers to do their own work filling in the implications. The passage Nella had transcribed described an account from a village, not named, in which a flight of dragons had lost a hatchling to a rockfall. The hatchling had survived the initial fall but was critically injured and had, according to the account, left the nest and traveled to the village below. The village healer who had written the account to Avarice Kale was not a man given to dramatic interpretation, and his description of what followed was measured and specific, and did not use the word remarkable until the very end, where he used it twice. The hatchling had not gone to the healer. It had gone to a man in the village, a carpenter, the account specified, which Edric noted, and had died there 3 days later. The carpenter had not done anything extraordinary, he had simply stayed. Avarice Kale's commentary on this account was brief. She used a term that Edric did not recognize, which Nella had rendered in her notes with a question mark beside it: tetherbond. Avarice had described it as a rare behavioral response in mortally compromised young dragons, a kind of last resort attachment mechanism that served, in the absence of a flight, to provide what she called anchoring, a point of stability in the world that allowed the biological systems to continue functioning at a baseline level rather than shutting down. She had used, in her spare and economical way, one sentence to describe the outcome when such a bond was successfully formed. The creature did not always die. That was all, one sentence. No elaboration, no discussion of mechanism, no indication of how often or under what conditions. Simply the observation, set down with the same plain weight as all her other observations, that the creature did not always die. Edric read this twice. Then he looked at the hatchling, which was still sleeping, its ribs moving in the rhythm of something that was continuing, and he said nothing at all, but in the silence he said a great deal. On the fifth day, the hatchling ate. It was not a dramatic eating. It was a small, experimental, deeply considered eating, the kind of eating that is less about hunger and more about an internal decision to re-engage with the ordinary requirements of existence. Edric had been putting food near it since the second day, not insistently, not with any performance of hopefulness, simply placing it in the available space and allowing the hatchling to ignore it or attend to it according to its own judgment. He had been putting out scraps of raw meat primarily on Draven the apothecary's advice, and also soft things, cooked egg, which had seemed an unlikely choice until the apothecary explained the specific proteins it provided, and a preparation of rendered fat mixed with herbs that Draven had devised and which smelled to Edric's nose like something that had gone wrong in a specific and deliberate way. On the fifth morning, the hatchling ate 3 small pieces of meat and licked the rendered fat preparation off Edric's finger with the careful, exploratory attention of a creature conducting a thorough investigation before committing to an opinion. Its tongue was rough and dry and very warm, and the contact of it was startling in a way that Edric did not anticipate and then immediately absorbed, adding it to the accumulating inventory of what the hatchling was, what it felt like, what being in proximity to it entailed. He told Nella, who told Soren, who came by that afternoon with the expression of a woman revising a prior conclusion and finding the process not entirely unwelcome. Soren examined the hatchling with her characteristic thorough quiet, pressing her fingers to the pulse points, listening with her carved horn, checking the eyes and the membrane color and several other things that Edric watched and noted and asked about afterward. He had learned over a lifetime of being her patient and her neighbor's patient and her former patient's neighbor, a person who answered direct questions directly, without buffering, which he appreciated. The pulse is still elevated, she said, sitting back from the hatchling, which had tolerated her examination with the resigned dignity of a patient who understands the necessity without enjoying it. But it has moderated. The first day it was 70% above what I'd consider baseline for a healthy hatchling of this size. Today it's perhaps 45 above. She paused. The eyes are clearer, not fully clear. But the opacity that comes from smoke exposure to the internal gland. The gland regulates the eye's moisture and clarity. There's been some resolution there. The breathings. She was quiet for a moment. The breathing is the same, the passage damage is the same. What it sounds like now is the same as what it sounded like on the first morning. It has not progressed. She looked at him with the expression of a person choosing her words carefully because imprecision would cost something. Smokelung progresses. In every case I have observed, in every case documented in the guild records, it progresses. The body's response to the initial scarring creates secondary scarring. The passages narrow over time, it does not stabilize. And yet, she agreed. They both looked at the hatchling, which was looking at Edric with the dark, steady attention that its eyes had begun to hold since they started clearing. A quality of focus that had replaced the earlier smoke-hazed searching and had settled into something more deliberate, more continuous, like a flame that had found a stable position in a windless room. "Have you heard of a tether bond?" Edric asked. Soren's expression changed. Not dramatically, Soren's expressions never changed dramatically, but the slight recalibration was visible, the adjustment of someone encountering a piece of information in a context that suggests a prior assessment may need updating. "Where did you come across that term?" "Nella, in your archive, Avris Kale." Kale, she said the name in a specific way, the way people said the names of predecessors whose work they respected without always agreeing with. She worked in the Keldmere region. Significant dragon presence there, more regular human-dragon contact than most villages experienced. Her accounts are, a slight pause, not always conventional in their framing. "Do you think she was wrong?" The pause this time was longer. Soren looked at the hatchling. The hatchling continued to look at Edric. Outside, the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light in mountain country did, going gold and long-shadowed, the quality of it shifting from the flat utility of midday to something softer and more complicated. "I think," Soren said finally, "that Avris Kale was a careful and precise observer who used the vocabulary available to her, which was limited, to describe things she had directly witnessed. I think she did not invent, I think she recorded." Another pause. I think the creature you have in your house has not followed the expected progression of its condition, and I think you are the reason for that, and I do not currently have a better framework for explaining it than the one Kale provided. This was, from Soren, a considerable statement. Edric received it in the way he received considerable things steadily, with full attention, without the performance of being overwhelmed. She said they did not always die, he said. She said that, yes. What did she say about the ones who didn't? Soren looked at him for a moment. That the damage remained, the passages do not repair themselves, the scarring is permanent, but that some creatures develop compensatory function, build around the constraint as it were, adapt their biology to accommodate a permanent limitation. She paused. She also said that the bond formed in such circumstances was permanent, between the creature and the person it had chosen. The word chosen sat in the room for a moment, doing its work. Permanent in what sense? Edric asked. In the sense that it does not resolve, Soren said, not a temporary attachment from circumstance, a structural bond, biological she believed though she did not have the means to confirm the mechanism. The creature orients to the bonded person the way it would orient to its flight as a primary point of reference, as home. Edric was quiet for a long time. The hatchling shifted slightly on its blankets and made the low, resonant sound it had been making with increasing frequency since the second day smoother now, less damaged sounding, developing a quality that was almost, in its way, musical, though to call it that felt presumptuous, felt like claiming an understanding of something whose nature he was only beginning to approach. He looked at it, it looked at him. All right, he said for the third time in as many days, meaning it more thoroughly each time. All right. That night after Soren had left and Nella had gone home and the village had folded itself into its evening routines, Edric sat by the hearth in the chair he used for reading, and he thought about permanence. He was not a man who had given much attention to permanence as a concept. He dealt in metal, which was permanent in some senses and not in others. Iron rusted, bronze corroded, even the most well-treated steel eventually yielded to time and use and the slow insistence of the world. Things he made lasted if made well for decades. Some lasted longer. The gate he had made for the church 20 years ago with the old smith's guidance was still the same gate it had been then, functional and true, though it had been mended 3 times and would need mending again. Permanence was a direction, in his experience, not an arrival, something you moved toward through the quality of your work, never fully reaching it but sometimes getting close enough that the difference ceased to matter. He thought about what it would mean to be permanently chosen by something. He had been chosen for things before. The old smith had chosen him as an apprentice, which had been both the most ordinary and the most consequential thing that had ever happened to him. Ordinary because it was the standard mechanism by which trades were transmitted, consequential because it had been, in practice, the transmission not just of skill, but of a whole relationship with the world, a whole way of looking at problems and materials and time. Nella's father had died without sons and with one daughter who was suited and willing, and he had chosen to leave the forge not to the guild to distribute but to Edric, which was another kind of choosing, carrying with it a weight of trust that Edric had not asked for and had been carrying carefully ever since. Those were choosings he understood. They had shapes he could trace, histories he could follow, reasons he could, if pressed, articulate. This was different. This had been a choosing without negotiation, without the slow accumulation of evidence that usually preceded it. The hatchling had looked at him across 30 feet of Market Square and 30 other people, and had made a decision, not a tentative decision, not a provisional one, but a decision committed to with the full weight of a failing body that could not afford to be wrong, and that decision was now, apparently, the structural fact of both of their lives going forward, not a temporary fact. Not subject to revision. Edric looked at the hatchling across the room. It was awake, though it had been resting, it seemed to sleep lightly, to maintain a continuous low-level awareness even in rest, and he had noticed that when he moved in the room it registered the movement without alerting, the way a dog registers a familiar person's presence without feeling the need to respond to it. It was aware of where he was at all times. It had been aware of where he was since he carried it in the door, tracking him not with the anxious attention of something that might lose him, but with the settled attention of something that has already resolved the question of whether he is there and is simply updating the knowledge as a matter of course. It was looking at him now with those eyes that were not pale anymore, not smoke-hazed, but darkening as they cleared, moving toward the amber they were meant to be, he thought, though it was still too early to be certain. The quality of the gaze had a depth to it that he found, if he was honest with himself, somewhat arresting, not uncomfortable, not the gaze of something alien and opaque, but a gaze that communicated clearly the presence of a consciousness that was looking at him with its full attention, and finding him, apparently sufficient finding him, in fact, exactly and completely what it had chosen him to be. There was something in being looked at that way that asked something of a person. Not a demand, it had none of the quality of demand in it. more the way a very precise question asked something by the precision of its framing of the quality of its answer. The hatchling looked at him with such complete and unself-conscious trust that it made him aware, in a way that ordinary life rarely required, of exactly what he was. Not what he was capable of, he had a reasonable working knowledge of that, but what he was at the level below capability, the level of disposition and inclination, and the decisions a person makes without knowing they are making them because the decisions are simply expressions of what they already fundamentally are. He was a person who did not leave. He had not known this about himself, not as a named and recognized characteristic. He would not have listed it among his qualities if asked. He was stubborn, he knew the kind of stubborn that bent toward problems rather than away from them, that found difficulty more interesting than discomfort found it unpleasant. He was patient. He was quiet. He was good at his work in ways that had more to do with the quality of his attention than the quantity of his talent. These were the things he knew about himself. He had not known that he was, in the reckoning of a dying dragon hatchling who had surveyed 30 people with the last of its useful energy, and found in him something that none of the others had. He had not known that he was the person who, without decision, without effort, without even awareness, simply did not leave. The hatchling had known it before he did. It had read in him something he had not yet read in himself, had found in the stillness of his feet on the cobblestones a quality that was worth crossing a market square to reach. And now here they were, the two of them, permanent to each other in ways that neither had chosen in any ordinary sense of the word but that felt. As Edric sat in his chair by the fire and looked at the creature that had decided to keep living because he was there to live near, as inevitable as iron. He reached for the book on the side table, a practical guide to metallurgical properties he had been working through for several months, dense with information he was still in the process of absorbing. He opened it to his mark. He read. The hatchling watched him read for a while, with the settled patience of something that has found its place in a room and is not going anywhere, and then lowered its head onto its forepaws and exhaled a long, rough, uneven sound and slept. The fire burned. The night settled over Ardenmoor and over the mountains above it, where somewhere the ruins of a nest were cooling in the dark. The hatchling breathed its imperfect, scarred, continuing breath. And Edric Reed and the room held them both, and outside the village went about its ancient business of enduring toward morning, which it had always done and would continue to do, with or without the extraordinary things that sometimes happened in its market square and went on happening quietly in an ordinary house at the end of an ordinary lane, for a long time after the crowd went home. The seventh morning arrived in the way that seventh mornings always do when one has been living inside a crisis, with a quality of ordinary light that feels almost offensive after a week of emergency, as though the sun has not received the appropriate communication about the gravity of recent events and has decided, in its usual indifferent way, to simply continue rising. The birds in the lane were conducting their usual argument over the usual territories. The baker down the street had his oven going, and the smell of it came through the window that Edric had opened slightly to let in the morning air, because the hatchling had begun, in the last 2 days, to show a preference for moving air, and he had adjusted the house's habits accordingly. The hatchling was awake when Edric came down from the loft. It had been awake, he suspected, for some time before he descended. It slept in shorter cycles than he did, surfacing into alertness for long quiet intervals in the deep hours and then returning to rest without apparent distress, as though wakefulness and sleep were not the opposed states they were for humans but two positions on a continuous dial, both of them ordinary, both of them fine. He had woken twice in the night to the awareness of its eyes in the dark, reflecting the banked ember light of the hearth, and both times the awareness had not alarmed him, had been, if anything, a kind of company. It was sitting up. This was new. For 6 days it had been horizontal, resting on its belly or its side, raising its head for water and food and the interactions it chose to initiate, but maintaining the low profile of something conserving effort and keeping its center of gravity as close to the ground as possible, which was the posture of both caution and weakness, and which Edric had learned to read as a continuous indicator of its current state. The sitting up was different. It was a vertical commitment, a choice to hold itself upright against gravity rather than yielding to it, and it required. He could see this in the slight tremor along its haunches, the effortful set of its shoulders, more than it had a week ago, more than it had yesterday, but not more than it currently had to spend. It was watching the window. Not Edric, not the door. The window, and through it the pale gold bar of morning light and the slice of lane visible below the sill and the fragment of sky above the roofline, which held a single cloud moving east in a deliberate, unhurried way that had all the quality of something with a destination. The hatchling watched it with an expression, if the word could be used, of absorption, of the kind of attention that is not assessing or calculating but simply receiving, simply allowing what is there to be what it is without attempting to resolve it into something useful. Edric stood on the last step of the loft stairs and did not announce himself, because the hatchling already knew he was there. He had observed this reliable quality in it, that his presence registered to it before his presence became visible, some sense beyond sight doing the work, and because there was something in the quality of its looking out the window that he did not want to interrupt. It had the quality of a person's first morning in a new place. After the initial strangeness has passed, and before full familiarity has arrived, that narrow band of perception where everything is seen freshly and nothing is yet taken for granted. He went to the kitchen and built up the fire and put the water on and assembled the hatchling's morning preparations, which had by now acquired the comfortable automaticity of a routine, the meat, the apothecary's preparations, the small bowl of water positioned at the height that the hatchling's current range of motion made most accessible. He moved quietly, not from any calculation, simply because the morning had a quietness about it that he found himself wanting to match. When he set the food down, the hatchling turned from the window and looked at it and then looked at him. And there was something in that sequence, window, food, him, that made a notation in him he could not yet read. A sensation of significance without yet having the key to its content. It ate 5 pieces of meat. This was 2 more than yesterday. Soren arrived at mid-morning. She came, as she had come every other day since the first, without ceremony and without the social cushioning that some visitors used to navigate the strangeness of the situation, the slight over-cheerfulness, the excessive normalizing, the performance of an ease they did not entirely feel. Soren did not perform ease. She felt what she felt and brought it with her and left the performance to people who had use for it. What she felt this morning, when she came through Edric's door and saw the hatchling sitting upright on its blankets in a bar of morning light, was something she took a moment to name even to herself. She had been in the business of bodies for 40 years. She had watched many things live and many things die and had developed, across that span, a finely calibrated internal instrument for reading the difference between the two, not a mystical sense, nothing so imprecise as intuition, but the accumulated pattern recognition of 10,000 assessments, the knowledge inscribed in her hands and her ears, and the specific quality of attention she brought to every examination. This instrument had told her 7 days ago that the hatchling was dying. It had told her this with the same confidence it brought to all its readings, which was the confidence of long experience rather than certainty, but which was still, by any reasonable measure, reliable. Standing in Edric's doorway looking at the hatchling sitting upright in the morning light, she was revising. Not revering, she was not a person who reversed without evidence. Revising, in the careful and specific sense of updating a model in response to new data, adjusting the parameters, checking the prior assumptions. The hatchling was not healthy. She could see this clearly, could see the slight tremor in the haunches that indicated the effort of maintaining position, could see the still irregular quality of the breathing, could see a dozen small signs of a body that was doing more than it should be able to do but was doing it through effort rather than ease. It was not healthy. It was also, demonstrably, not dying in the way she had understood it to be dying, and these two facts needed to be held together rather than allowing one to cancel the other. "Good morning," she said to both of them, because she was a person who had long since stopped reserving certain courtesies for species she was certain could understand them. The hatchling looked at her, not with the unfocused, smoke-hazed uncertainty of its first morning, not with the minimal attention of a creature conserving itself, but with a clear, calm, assessing regard, the look, she thought, of something that had taken her measure at some prior point, and had arrived at a conclusion about her that it was now simply confirming rather than reconducting. She crossed to it and crouched and performed her examination. She was thorough. She was always thorough, but today she was thorough in the specific way of someone who understands that what she finds this morning is going to require her to say something she has not said before, and she wants to be very certain of the ground before she says it. The pulse still elevated above baseline, but the elevation had moderated again, not 45% above now, closer to 25. The kind of elevation that, in a healthy creature of this age, would be explained entirely by the ordinary excitement of a morning, by the birds outside the window and the smell of food and the specific alertness of a young animal beginning to engage with a world it is starting to trust. The eyes clear, not clearing. Clear, the opacity was resolved, or resolved enough that what remained was at the edge of her instrument's ability to distinguish from normal. The color they had been moving toward was there now. A genuine amber, not the pale ghost of it, but the thing itself, warm and present, catching the light in the particular way of eyes built to process it at very different intensities and distances than human eyes were built for. The breathing, she listened for a long time, longer than she needed to perhaps, or perhaps exactly as long as she needed to in order to be certain of what she was hearing. The passages were still scarred. She could hear the scar tissue in the sound of each breath, the slight roughness, the imperfection of air moving through channels that were not as wide or as smooth as they were meant to be. The smoke lung was not gone, it would never be gone. But the sound of it had changed in a quality that she was going to describe to Edric as compensation. because that was the most accurate word she had, though it was not quite adequate. It was the sound of a body that had encountered a permanent obstacle and had spent a week performing the internal engineering of routing around it, building new capacity in the spaces adjacent to the damaged ones, redistributing function across a different architecture than the original. It was the sound of survival through adaptation. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the hatchling, which looked back at her with its clear amber eyes and its sitting upright posture and its 7-day-old impossibility of continued existence. And she felt, in the deep and private place where 40 years of practice had deposited all the things that did not fit neatly into her professional vocabulary, something that she would not have called wonder in front of anyone, but which was, in fact, wonder. Edric, she said. I see it, he said from across the room, where he was standing with his arms folded, and his expression doing the thing it did when he was paying close attention to something going very still, the quality of attention increasing as the outward indicators of it decreased, like a fire that burns hotter when it burns quieter. Its air sacs are still scarred, she said. They will always be scarred. It will never breathe as a healthy dragon breathes. She paused in the way of a person giving accurate information the space it needs to be fully received before continuing. But it is compensating, actively compensating building function around the damage rather than being constrained by it. I have not seen this progression in smokelung before, in any species. Another pause. I do not think it will die of this. The sentence sat in the room. It was a sentence she had not expected to say this week. She was aware of this and aware of Edric being aware of it, and there was a quality in the shared awareness that was not quite emotion in any simple sense but was something she had no better word for than rightness. The feeling of a thing having gone as it should have, against considerable odds, for reasons that were not yet fully understood but that were real enough to have produced this outcome, this sitting hatchling, these clearing eyes, this adapted and imperfect and continuing breath. It's stubborn, Edric said. He said it simply, the way he said most things, and the hatchling, as though it had been waiting for precisely this observation, made the sound, the low, resonant, increasingly smooth sound that had been developing across the week, moving further each day from the damaged roughness of its origin towards something that had its own quality, its own character, the sound of a voice finding itself. It made the sound, and it looked at Edric and the look, and the sound together constituted something that Soren observed with the full attention of a woman who had been in the world, long enough to know that some things were worth observing completely. The village found out, as villages find out, through the ordinary channels of proximity and observation, and the social infrastructure of people who live close enough together that very little happens to any one of them without eventually happening, in some attenuated form, to all of them. It was not a dramatic finding out. There was no announcement, no gathering, no official communication from the village elder, though Croft had stopped by twice in the first week with his quiet, official concern, and had gone away both times with the expression of a man who is not sure whether he is witnessing a problem or its resolution. The information moved through Ardenmoor the way information in small places always moved, through Nella telling the apothecary, who told his wife, who told 3 people at the well, through the baker who had seen the hatchling brought into Edric's house on the first afternoon and who had not been able to entirely keep this to himself, through the small girl who had said it walked past you, whose name was Pyrrha, and who had asked her mother 17 direct questions about dragons in the week since, and had received in return a parental education on the limits of available knowledge, through Soren, who said nothing directly but whose specific quality of silence on the subject communicated more than most people's speech. What the village learned over those first 2 weeks was this: there was a dragon in Edric Voss's house. The dragon was the surviving hatchling from whatever fire had come down from the mountains on the night of its arrival. The dragon had been expected to die. The dragon had not died. The dragon was, by the account of the guild healer who had examined it 6 times, and was not a woman given to imprecision, adapting to its damage in a way that was not previously documented, and was continuing to improve by small, consistent increments that, while not restoring it to health in any conventional sense, were redefining the available meaning of the word healthy in this specific case. The village's response to this information was, like most of the village's responses to unusual things, a mixture of the practical and the philosophical weighted heavily toward the practical. People wanted to know things. Not dangerous things, not the prying things of prurient interest, but the natural and reasonable things of neighbors whose world had been altered, and who were in the process of understanding what that alteration meant for the ordinary conduct of their lives. Was it safe? This was the primary question, arriving in various formulations from various people. Did Edric have control of it? Would it grow? What happened when it grew? What did it eat, and was it eating livestock? Because John the shepherd had reported a missing hen last Tuesday, and the timing was no, Edric said to this last. It ate what he provided, and it had not left the house unaccompanied, and the hen was almost certainly the work of the fox that had been working the eastern coops for 3 weeks, which John already knew and was simply seeking a more dramatic explanation for, which was characteristic of John. Was it going to stay? This was the second question, and it was more complex than it appeared, because it contained within it several subsidiary questions about what stayed meant and for how long and under what conditions, and whether the arrangement was one that could be altered if circumstances changed. Edric answered this question in the way he answered questions whose full complexity he was still in the process of understanding himself, with a directness that did not pretend to more certainty than he had, and a steadiness that communicated the parts he was certain about. Yes, he said, it is going to stay. What that means for the long term I will figure out as it arrives, the same way I figure out everything else. People found this answer on the whole sufficient. Edric had been in Ardenmoor his entire life. He was known. The things people knew about him, his reliability, his patience, his particular brand of unhurried competence, were things that translated reasonably well to the new context. If Edric said it was staying and he had it in hand, the village's collective assessment was that it was probably in hand. This was trust, the ordinary village kind, earned across 26 years of being the same person in the same place. Piera came to see it on the 10th day. She came with her mother, Denna, who was a weaverwoman and who had the particular practical boldness of people who work with their hands and are accustomed to treating difficult materials with direct engagement rather than cautious circumnavigation. Denna had brought a small cake, the kind made with dried apples and honey that was Ardenmoor's default expression of goodwill toward neighbors in unusual circumstances, and she presented it to Edric with the slightly self-conscious acknowledgement that she was not entirely sure what the protocol was for this situation, and had defaulted to the gesture that covered most situations in her experience. Piera was 7 and had been thinking about dragons for 10 days, with the comprehensive and unapologetic focus that 7-year-olds brought to subjects that had seized their attention. She came through the door and looked at the hatchling, which was on its feet, properly on its feet now, standing on all 4 legs with only a slight unevenness in the rear haunches that spoke of muscles still rebuilding their confidence. And she looked at it for a long and serious moment, with the expression of someone reconciling what they had imagined with what they were actually seeing. "It's smaller than I thought," she said. "Most things are," Edric said. Piera considered this philosophical observation and appeared to file it for future use. She took a step toward the hatchling and then stopped, not from fear but from the same instinct that had made her stop at the edge of the crowd 10 days ago, the instinct of a child who understood, better than many adults, that there was a difference between the space you were in and the space that belonged to something else, and that crossing into the second kind required a different kind of permission than the first. "Can I come closer?" she asked, not of Edric, of the hatchling. The hatchling regarded her. It had been regarding her since she came through the door, with the calm, assessing attention it brought to new things, not the wariness of something that expected threats, but the genuine interest of a creature that had begun, cautiously, to understand that this particular world contained things worth knowing. The child was small and smelled of wool and bread and the outside air, and was looking at it with an expression that contained no performance in it at all, only the naked and unguarded quality of genuine wanting to see, which was perhaps the most honest expression available in any face, human or otherwise. The hatchling took 3 steps toward her. Piera's face did something extraordinary. Not surprised, she had been expecting something to happen, had been braced for some version of a response, had readied herself. What happened to her face was more than that. It was the expression of a person receiving something they had hoped for without believing they would receive it. The expression that lives in the precise moment between hope and its fulfillment, before the intellect has caught up to the fact and begun the work of incorporating it into the ordinary story of the world. She held out her hand. The hatchling lowered its head and pressed its nose briefly against her palm, a gesture that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, dry and warm and deliberate, and then stepped back and looked at Edric in the way it always looked at Edric. The steady, complete, orienting look of something confirming the position of its north. Piera looked at her hand, then she looked at Edric. "Does it have a name?" she asked. Edric opened his mouth and then closed it again, because the question had arrived before he had arrived at an answer to it, and he was not a man who gave answers he had not fully considered. "Not yet," he said. Piera nodded with the gravity of one who understands that some things should not be rushed. "When you find it," she said, "will you tell me?" "Yes," he said, "I will." He found the name on the 14th day in the late afternoon while he was at the forge. He had returned to the forge on the 9th day, when the hatchling had demonstrated sufficiently, across several careful tests, that it could be trusted in the house alone for the duration of a working shift. This had not been a simple determination. It had involved a series of graduated absences, beginning with the few minutes required to go to the well and returning, then extending to an hour, then 2, each departure and return observed for signs of distress, each interval assessed for evidence of how the hatchling used time in his absence. What he had found was that it used time in his absence much as it used time in his presence, with a quality of self-possessed patience that he had not expected, but that, on reflection, made a kind of sense. It was not waiting for him in the anxious way of a creature that could not tolerate separation. It was simply existing in the world, conducting its own investigation of its immediate environment, and registering his return with a calm and complete attention that had nothing frantic in it. The greeting not of something that had been surviving his absence, but of something that had been living in it. The forge had accumulated a backlog, as forges do when their primary smith is absent for a week and a half, and Nella had managed it with competence and visible relief at his return. He had worked through it methodically, in order of urgency, and had reached Ostafarin's gate hinge on the afternoon of the 14th day. The hinge had been waiting 3.5 weeks by this point, and the solution that had been clear in his mind on the morning of the hatchling's arrival had survived the intervening days intact. He had been working on it in the background of everything else that had happened, the way he always worked on problems, in the underneath layer of attention that ran continuously regardless of what the surface was occupied with. He knew what he needed to do. He began. The work of it was good work. The kind of work that required the full engagement of his hands and his attention and the particular quality of judgment that could not be taught but could be developed. The sense of when the material was right and when it was not, the feel of the metal at temperature, the timing of the hammer that was partly mechanical knowledge and partly something else, something he had no word for, that lived in the junction between tool and material and hand. He was, in this work, entirely himself in the most complete available sense of the word, and the completeness of it had a quality he recognized and valued and did not take for granted. He was shaping the third component of the hinge assembly, working the metal with the particular focused repetition of hammer strikes that moved it toward its intended form, when he thought of the hatchling, and following from that thought, without knowing quite why, the Ashbeak word for forge fire. He had the word from an old shepherd who had come down from the upper pastures when Edric was 15, and who had stayed in Ardenmoor through one winter, working odd jobs, trading stories from the high country for room and board. The man had picked up fragments of language from the mountain communities further up the range, people who had lived closer to the flights for generations, and had developed in that proximity a vocabulary for things that the lower villages did not have words for. The word was ashari. It meant, as near as the shepherd had been able to translate it, something like the fire that was there before you arrived and will be there after you leave, not the temporary fire of a specific burning, but the persisting nature of fire as a condition of the world, the fire that the mountain people understood the dragons to carry in them not as a weapon or a threat but as a fundamental characteristic, the way water carried its wetness and stone carried its hardness. It meant, in the shorthand the shepherd had used when the longer translation became unwieldy, the fire that stays. Edric set down his hammer. He stood for a moment in the heat and light of the forge, with the metal cooling on the anvil and the name settling into him with the particular quality of things that are not chosen so much as recognized. The things that arrive already fitting the space they are meant to fill, so that the work of the name is not assignment but discovery. He went home that evening and told the hatchling its name, and the hatchling for the first time made it sound not in response to something Edric had done but apparently in response to the sound of the word itself, as though it recognized it or recognized the thing the word was pointing at, which was the same thing Edric recognized when he applied the word to the creature that had crawled across a market square on failing lungs to reach him. Something that had been here before the crisis and would be here after it, not because it was impervious to damage, but because it had, in the most essential and available sense, decided to stay. Soren came on the morning of the third week for what she said would be her last formal examination, in the way of someone closing an official file, not because her interest had ended, but because the framework of urgent medical assessment no longer fit the situation, and she was precise about the correct application of frameworks. She examined Ashari, she used the name, having been told it the previous evening, with the same unceremonious acceptance she brought to all new information, with the thoroughness she had brought to every prior examination. She went through every measurement, every indicator, every point of comparison with the week-old data she carried in her memory with the accuracy of a mind that had been trained to retain such things, and had never stopped exercising that training. When she finished, she remained crouched beside Ashari for a moment longer than the examination required. She was looking at the breathing, at the visible rise and fall of the small ribs, at the sound of it that was imperfect and scarred, and had been imperfect and scarred for 3 weeks and would be imperfect and scarred forever. And that was also, unmistakably and with increasing confidence, simply the breathing of something alive. She stood with the careful slowness of her knees, and she turned to Edric, who was at the kitchen table with his tea and the focused neutrality of a man who has learned that receiving significant information well requires a certain internal preparation. Its air sacs are still scarred, she said. She had begun with this sentence every examination, the same words in the same order, not from habit but from the deliberate practice of keeping the baseline visible, not allowing improvement to erase the record of damage that improvement was working around. They will always be scarred, he said, finishing the familiar sequence. It will never breathe as a healthy dragon breathes. No, she agreed, it will breathe as this dragon breathes, which is its own category. She sat down across the table from him, which she did not usually do, which told him the conversation was going to be of a different kind than their usual exchanges. I want to tell you what I expect to happen, not what I am certain of. I have not sufficient data to be certain of very much in this situation, but what I expect based on what I have observed. All right, he said. The compensation will continue. The body's adaptation to the scarring is ongoing. I can see it progressing from examination to examination. The change is small but consistent. There is no guarantee of how far this will go. I cannot tell you that it will eventually breathe without difficulty. I think it will always have difficulty. But difficulty is not the same as crisis, and crisis is what I expected 3 weeks ago and is not what I am observing now. She folded her hands on the table. I expect it to grow. Dragons grow continuously in their first years, the rate slows as they mature, but in the early period the growth is significant. I do not know how the scarring will respond to the changes in body size. It is possible the growth will create new pressures. It is possible, and this is my stronger expectation, that the compensatory structures it is building will scale with the growth, that the adaptation will expand alongside the body and maintain its function. And if the first, Edric said, if the growth creates new pressure, then we respond to what we find when we find it, as one always does. She looked at him with the direct, uncushioned regard she reserved for things she wanted received without softening. You should know that what you are taking on is genuinely without a known outcome. I am a healer of 40 years, and I am telling you honestly that I do not know what this creature's life will look like in a year, in 5 years, in 20. I have no model for it. What I have is the observation of 3 weeks in which it has consistently exceeded every expectation I brought to it. And the reasonable inference that a creature capable of that degree of consistent exceeding is probably going to continue finding ways to be the exception to the rules I apply to it. She said this last part with something in her voice that was not quite warmth. Soren's voice was not a warm instrument in the conventional sense, but that held within it a quality of regard, a quality of being pleased by, that she applied very selectively, and that Edric received as the significant thing it was. There is one more thing, she said, the bond. He waited. I have done further reading since our last conversation. In Kale and in 2 other sources she referenced that I was able to locate in the extended archive. She was quiet for a moment in the way of a person who has found information that has altered something in them and is deciding how much of that alteration to communicate. The tether bond, as she described it, it is not only the dragon's bond. It runs in both directions. The dragon orients to the person. But the accounts suggest the person also changes. Not dramatically, not in ways that are legible from outside, but in their relationship to the world over time. Kale described it as a recalibration of presence. The bonded person becomes gradually more acutely present to whatever is immediately around them, more difficult to distract, more fully in the room where they are. She looked at Edric, who was already the person she was describing, who had been that person since before the hatchling arrived, who was sitting at his kitchen table with his tea going cold and his full attention on her without any visible effort at attention, simply present in the way of something that does not know how to be otherwise. I suspect, she said very quietly, that she chose well. Edric was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she, and looked at Ashari with the expression of a person receiving information about something they have been looking at for 3 weeks and recognizing, for the first time, one of its features. The coloring of the eye membrane in amber-class hatchlings indicates sex, Soren said. The amber developing toward gold is female. I should have mentioned it sooner. I wasn't certain until the eyes cleared. Ashari, Edric said to himself as much as to Ashari recalibrating. The name held. It still fit. Ashari, who was sitting in a bar of morning light by the window with her tail curled around her feet in a gesture of comfort that was entirely her own and not learned from any model, looked at him and made her sound steady, low, the fire that stays, and returned to watching the lane outside, where the morning was conducting its ordinary business of being the morning, indifferent to the extraordinary things happening in the rooms that opened onto it. The months that followed were the months of ordinary life, which is to say they were the months in which the extraordinary things that had happened were gradually absorbed into the fabric of daily existence and became, incrementally, simply the way things were. Ashari grew, not quickly. Her growth was slower than Soren had expected for a healthy hatchling of her age, which the healer attributed to the energy her body was directing toward compensation rather than expansion, and which Edric observed with the same attention he brought to all her changes, nodding the increments, watching for the pressures Soren had warned of and finding them so far manageable. She grew through the autumn and the winter in the way of a plant growing toward available light, not by the path of least resistance, but by the path of most access, finding the angles and adjustments that her particular constraints required, developing a body that was entirely her own rather than a compromised version of some template. She learned the forge. This had not been planned. It had emerged from the same process by which she learned everything, which was proximity and attention, and the particular quality of mind she had that did not distinguish between things worth knowing and things not worth knowing, that simply absorbed what was available and sorted it later. She began accompanying Edric to the forge on the 32nd day, when her legs had built enough reliability to manage the walk without taxing her breathing, and she sat in the forge with the same contained, observational quality she brought to everything, and she watched him work. She liked the heat. This was the first obvious preference she demonstrated, as opposed to the preferences he had inferred from observation, the preference for moving air, for morning light, for the low sounds rather than the high ones. The forge's heat was a specific enveloping kind, the kind that came from controlled combustion carefully maintained, and she received it with a quality of recognition that made him think of the shepherd's word again, the fire that was there before you arrived. She did not get too close to the active work. She understood the difference between the ambient heat of the space and the directed heat of the process, and she maintained the boundary between them with the same calm judgment she brought to all boundaries. But she sat in the warmth of the forge, and she watched him work with an attention that was, over time, not simply observation but comprehension, the attention of something that was learning, taking in the relationship between action and outcome, between intention and material, between what the hands did and what the metal became. Nella initially was careful around her. Not afraid. Nella was not a person given to fear, or rather was a person who experienced fear normally and then moved through it rather than around it, but careful in the way of someone who is updating a large prior belief and wants to be thorough about it. The prior belief was dragons are one thing. The new information was this dragon, specifically, exists and is here and is part of the workshop now. And these two things needed to be reconciled with the care that any significant update required. The reconciliation took approximately 2 weeks, at the end of which Nella was talking to Ashari in the same direct, unsentimental way she talked to everything, and Ashari was responding to her with the clear-eyed attention she gave to people she had assessed as honest, which was the highest regard she appeared to offer. "She's watching my technique," Nella told Edric one afternoon with a mixture of pride and mild unease. "That's what that face is. She's watching how I do things and comparing it to how you do them." "Probably," Edric said. "What does that mean for me?" "Probably means you should keep your technique sound," he said, and went back to what he was doing. And Nella went back to what she was doing with the expression of someone who had received a piece of professional motivation from an unexpected quarter, and was in the process of deciding whether to be annoyed by it or simply use it. The mountains made themselves known once in the late winter of Ashari's first year. Edric had been expecting this, not with dread, not with specific plans for what he would do. He had observed that specific plans for situations he could not yet see clearly tended to be more consoling than useful, and he preferred to save his planning for when the actual shape of the situation became visible. But he had been aware, in the background of everything else, that the mountains contained Ashari's original world, and that this world was not inert, and that it would, at some point, register what had happened to one of its members. The registration came as a shadow. Not the brief, confirmable or not shadow of the high-altitude glimpses Ardenmore was accustomed to, those dark shapes on thermals that the eye could argue with, that might have been a very large bird or a trick of the light, or the thing everyone knew it was but chose not to name. This was a deliberate shadow, a shadow that stayed, that circled the village in a wide, slow arc at a height that was low enough for intent to be unmistakable and high enough for action to be, for the present, withheld. The village noticed. The village did what it did when it noticed things from the mountains. It grew very quiet and very still in the collective way of communities that have been managing a proximity for a long time and know that the management requires, above all, the communication of non-aggression. People did not gather in the square. People went to the windows and looked up briefly, with the carefully composed expressions of people who are aware that they are being assessed, and who want the assessment to conclude in a specific direction. Edric took Ashari to the yard behind the forge. He had thought about this, where to go, where to position the interaction, what the variables were. The yard was open to the sky but defined enough to communicate that she was established here, that she had a territory in the human sense rather than existing as a lost and unclaimed thing. He wanted whatever was above to see her and to see her context, the house, the forge, the yard, the human beside her, and to arrive at whatever conclusion that context warranted. Ashari looked up without alarm. She had known before he had that something was above, had registered it through whatever mechanism she used for such registrations, had been looking upward with a focused stillness since before the shadow was visible to him, and had made apparently some internal assessment of it that had produced neither distress nor the desire to retreat. She stood in the yard in the cold winter light and she looked up at the circling shape, and her posture was the posture of something that knew what it was looking at and was not afraid of it but was also not subject to it, not submissive, not defiant, simply present in its own ground with its own established fact of being there. The shape circled 3 times. Then it rose, with the effortless ascent of something very large using the column of warm air that always rose from the forge's chimney in cold weather, and it went back up the mountain and did not come back. Edric stood in the yard for a while after it was gone. He was not sure what had just occurred in any precise and definitive sense. He was not sure whether Ashari had been recognized, or assessed, or released, or claimed in some way he did not understand, or whether the flight above had made some determination that he was simply not equipped to read. He realized, been holding a breath he had not known he was holding, and he let it out now in the cold air, a plume of vapor that dissipated into the clean winter sky. Ashari pressed the side of her head against his hip, briefly, with the easy confidence of a gesture she had made many times. Not seeking comfort, he had learned to distinguish between the two, but offering it in her particular way, which was the way of a creature that had decided he was hers to offer things to, and intended to continue offering them for as long as there was a him to offer them to. "All right," he said a 3rd time, a 1,000th time, "all right." Spring came in the way that spring came in mountain country, not all at once, not with the clean dramatic arrival of seasons in gentler climates, but in installments in a long negotiation between the cold that did not want to leave and the warmth that was coming regardless. The snow line retreated up the ashpeaks by feet rather than yards, slowly enough that each day looked almost identical to the last, and only the accumulation of days made the change visible. The lower trails opened. The shepherds took their flocks back to the middle pastures. The world unfolded itself from the compressed, cautious version it had been in winter and remembered that it was, in its full expression, considerably larger. Ashari grew into the spring like a plant growing into its season. Her body, which had been slow and deliberate through the winter, moving with the careful economy of something that was building more than it was showing, expanded with the warmth in a way that was not dramatic but was unmistakable, a lengthening, a filling out, the early suggestion of the shape she was growing toward. She was not large. She would not, Edric suspected, be large in the way that the shapes on the mountain thermals were large. The smoke-lung damage had altered too much of the early developmental architecture for that, or so Soren suggested with the honest uncertainty of someone who was estimating beyond the edge of available knowledge. But she was larger than she had been, and the way she moved was different, less effortful, more settled into her body, more the movement of something that had made its arrangements with its own physical reality and was no longer negotiating with it. She could run by early spring in short bursts. The first time this happened, Edric was in the yard and she was at the far end, and a pigeon landed in the middle of the space between them and she went for it, not with predatory urgency but with something between playfulness and curiosity, a testing of what her legs could do, and they did more than they had. They carried her the length of the yard in a quick, low surge that startled both the pigeon and him. The pigeon departed. Ashari stood at the end of her run and looked at him with an expression he had come to recognize as satisfaction, the expression of a self-assessment that had returned a positive result, and then walked back with the composed deliberateness of something that had made its point and was ready to move on. He told no one about the run that day. He sat with it himself, the way he sat with things that were too full to share immediately without losing something of what they contained, and he held the image of her crossing the yard, the low, quick surge of it, the improbable legs that had once barely supported her weight now carrying her through space with a confidence that had no business existing in the body that had carried her into the market square 9 months ago, and he felt something that he did not attempt to name. Because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. On a morning in late spring, the morning of the anniversary that Edric was aware of without having marked it on any calendar, he was at the forge with Nella when Pyrrha appeared in the doorway. She was 8 now, taller than she had been, with the slightly different quality of 8 that 7 had not yet possessed, a shade more self-possession, a shade more of the person she was becoming visible alongside the child she still was. She had come, as she had come several times over the winter, to see Ashari. These visits had developed their own character over the months Pyrrha arrived. Ashari acknowledged her arrival with the greeting she reserved for people she had classified as known and acceptable, which was a steady and unhurried regard and the brief lowering of her head, and the two of them occupied a portion of the forge yard together in a companionable silence that Edric had observed from a distance with the quiet attention he brought to things he valued. They had, he understood, arrived at a friendship of their own kind, conducted in a register he was not fully party to and did not attempt to enter. Children and young animals had an understanding that adults sometimes lost access to, not an innocence, not the soft and overused word, but a directness of engagement, a willingness to be in a relationship without needing to define it first, that some people retained as they aged and many did not, and that Pyrrha had in abundance and Ashari had always had, because Ashari had never been taught that it needed to be otherwise. Today Pyrrha came into the forge rather than stopping at the yard, which was unusual. She stood in the doorway in the forge heat and the light of it with Ashari behind her, and she said, "Edric, can I ask you something?" "Yes," he said, setting down his work. "Do you know what she is?" He looked at Pyrrha. He looked at Ashari, who was standing at Pyrrha's shoulder in the posture she used when she was paying full attention, slightly forward, head at the level that allowed her eyes their maximum range. The orientation of a creature that has arranged itself to see everything available from the best position it can find. "Say more," he said. I mean, Pyrrha searched for the words with the serious concentration of a child who knows what she means and is trying to find the language that will carry it intact. "Everyone says she's a dragon, and she is, but she's not like the ones up there." She tilted her head toward the mountains. "She's something different because of what happened to her and because of another search. Because of you, she's both things. She's from there and she's from here." Edric was quiet. He looked at Ashari, who was looking at him, and he thought about what Pyrrha had said with the same seriousness with which he thought about everything, because it deserved it. "Yes," he said finally, "I think that's right." "Is there a word for it?" Pyrrha asked. "Not yet," he said, "maybe there will be." Pyrrha appeared to find this satisfactory, in the way that children who are genuinely thinking find answers that acknowledge the open edge of a question more satisfying than answers that pretend to close it. She went back out to the yard. Ashari followed her, with one backward glance at Edric that contained, in its amber-clear morning light quality, the steady and complete and continuing acknowledgement of him, the you that she had chosen on a cold cobblestone morning a year ago to organize her world around. He watched them go. Then he picked up the hinge he was working on, not Ostaferans, which had long since been delivered and installed, and was performing exactly as intended. A different hinge for a different gate, another in the long sequence of useful things he made and would continue to make, and he resumed his work, and the sound of the hammer filled the forge, and outside in the yard Ashari and Pyrrha conducted their friendship in their own language, and the mountains stood above Ardmore in the late spring light, old and vast and full of lives that did not ask permission, and the world continued in all its dimensions, ordinary and extraordinary at once. As it had always continued, and as it would. In the Guild archive, on a shelf that was not frequently consulted but was maintained with the same careful attention as all the others, there was a folder that had not been there a year ago. It had been placed there by Soren Aldgate, who had written its contents herself, across the months of observation, in the dense and economical style of a person who expected her readers to do their own work filling in the implications. The folder was labeled in her precise and unornamented hand simply, "One case, Tetherbond confirmed, Ardmore ongoing." Inside it were her examination notes, her measurements, her observations across 31 formal assessments and many informal ones. Inside it was the account of the first morning, the diagnosis, the expected progression, and the progression that had actually occurred. Inside it was her discussion of Avarice Kale and the prior accounts and how the present case compared with them, in the ways it conformed and the ways it exceeded even Kale's careful, modest documentation. Inside it was a section on Edric, written with the same plain honesty she brought to everything, describing what she had observed in him over the year, the quality of his presence, the specific nature of his staying, the thing the hatchling had found in him that she had found herself increasingly unable to attribute to coincidence or convenience, and increasingly obliged to attribute to the thing it actually was. A fundamental characteristic of the person, recognized by a dying creature across 30 feet of Market Square and judged, correctly, to be exactly what was needed. The last page of the folder contained a single paragraph, written more recently than the rest, in the same hand but with a quality slightly different from the clinical observations that preceded it, slightly less compressed, slightly more willing to take up space. "I have been a healer for 40 years and I have witnessed many things arrive at their end. I have witnessed fewer things arrive, against all the evidence I was able to bring to bear at a continuation. I do not have a full accounting for what has occurred here. I do not expect to acquire one. What I have is the record, the pulse measurements and the breathing assessments and the growth observations and the 31 formal examinations of a creature that should not be alive and is. And the one informal observation I return to more than any of the others, which is the morning I stood in a market square and watched a man sit down on cold cobblestones and say hello, and a dying thing here in that word the only thing it had been looking for, which was not healing and not rescue. And not any extraordinary intervention, but simply the plain and radical fact of being stayed with. I do not know what to call that. I know what it did. I will let the record speak. She had not signed it. She did not sign her case notes. The record spoke for itself, as records did when they were kept with sufficient honesty, and the record was this. A hatchling had crawled toward a human, and the human had stayed, and neither of them had been the same afterward, and both of them were still here.